The town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your family history, and what you had for dinner last Tuesday. It was a place of quiet streets, white picket fences, and a town square with a bronze statue of a founding father. No one could quite remember the name of Alina. Had moved there 6 months ago, hoping to disappear. The quiet life was her new mission, and so far, it had been a difficult one to complete. She was a tall woman with the kind of shoulders that spoke of strength, not from a gym but from years of hard work and heavier loads. Her dark hair was usually tied back in a neat bun, and her hands, though strong, moved with a surprising grace. She wasn't looking for trouble. All she wanted was to be left alone with her memories and the new, simple job she had found. Alina cleaned windows. It was a good, honest living. It kept her busy and allowed her to work with a quiet focus, a skill she had perfected in another life, a life she was trying very hard to forget. Her precision was a thing to behold. She didn't just wash windows, she made them disappear. Every streak, every smudge, every speck of dust was a target, and her squeegee was a tool of surgical accuracy. The small business owners of Willow Creek, from the bakery to the hardware store, were pleased with her work. They saw her as a hard-working, if somewhat silent, new neighbor. But not everyone was so welcoming. A man named Gary, who owned a dusty, old auto shop on the edge of town, seemed to have taken an instant dislike to her. Gary was a barrel-chested man with a permanent scowl and a booming voice that made even the town's quietest dogs flinch. He and his son Dustin, a younger, less confident, but equally sour version of his father, were the town's self-proclaimed kings of the local shooting range. They liked to talk loudly about their skills, their guns, and their imagined importance. Alina first crossed paths with them while cleaning the windows of the town hall. Gary and Dustin were walking by, and Gary stopped, planting his feet firmly on the sidewalk. "Look at this, Dustin," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A little girl trying to make a living with a mop and bucket. You'd think a woman with those hands would be doing something a bit more delicate," Dustin snickered. Alina didn't even turn her head, she just kept working. Her movements steady and focused. She knew what they were doing. They were trying to get a reaction. In her old life, she had learned that the best way to handle a loud, angry opponent was to stay calm, to not give them the attention they craved. Gary wasn't done. "I heard she was a soldier," he scoffed, loud enough for a few to hear. "Probably worked in the kitchen. Nothing wrong with that, I guess. But a woman's place is, well, it's not on the front line, that's for sure." The words were like a physical blow, but Alina held her ground. She just tightened her grip on her squeegee. Her mind went back to the dusty landscapes of faraway places, to the deafening silence of a long-range mission, to the faces of her fallen teammates. The sacrifices they had all made felt cheapened by this man's ignorance. She finished the window, packed her gear, and walked away without a word. This became a regular occurrence. Gary and Dustin would find her, usually while she was working, and make their comments. They called her Squeaky and Private Squeaky, mocking her silent demeanor. Their words were always simple, but the poison in them was complex. They were hitting at her core, at her service, at the very things that had made her the woman she was. But Alina, a woman who had faced down real danger and stared into the eye of true evil, wouldn't let their small-town venom get to her. Had seen worse. She had survived worse. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the windows of the town's small coffee shop, a kind older woman named Martha saw the whole thing. Martha was a sweet lady with silver hair and a kind smile, and she was the keeper of Willow Creek's best baked goods. She came outside and stood beside Alina. "Don't you mind them," she said softly, patting Alina on the arm. "They're just two sad boys who like to make noise. They've never done anything important in their lives." Alina finally looked at her and gave her a small, grateful smile. "I know," she said, her voice a quiet, warm surprise to Martha. "Thank you." Martha looked at the newspaper in her hand and then at Alina. "I saw a picture of you once," she said, her voice now a little more serious. "You were in a newspaper story, something about a medal you won. You were a soldier, a hero." Alina just gave a small shake of her head. That was a long time ago, but Martha wasn't to be deterred. "It says you were a sniper. A very good one, one of the best." Gary, who had been listening from his shop across the street, heard this. He walked over, a smirk on his face. "A sniper," he scoffed, laughing a deep belly laugh. I bet her best shot was into a trash can from 10 feet away. The military puts all kinds of garbage in the papers. My grandpa was in the Marines, a real hero. He always said the real soldiers are quiet. They don't brag." Alina's eyes, which had been calm and distant, now held a cold fire. Gary had no idea what he was talking about, no idea of the quiet and terrible sacrifices she had seen. He had never walked the path of a silent warrior, a ghost in the shadows. He had never felt the crushing weight of a mission, the cold calculation of a single shot. His words were a lie, a betrayal of everything she had ever stood for. Gary leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. Me and my boy Dustin were the best shots in this town. We're in the local shooting competition next month. Top prize is $1,000 and the Golden Eagle trophy. It's for real shooters. The kind who know what a real rifle feels like, not just a mop handle. He held her gaze, a challenge in his eyes, a challenge he was sure she would never take. It's too bad you're busy with your windows. The final word hung in the air, a final, cutting insult. Alina simply looked at him, her face a mask of stone. She wouldn't dignify his challenge with a response. She was not a braggart, and her true self was a thing she kept locked away, a treasure too precious for the likes of him. She simply turned back to her work, her movements no longer graceful, but filled with a quiet, terrible rage. Her squeegee scraped against the glass with a harsh, final sound. The challenge had been laid down, and even though she wanted to walk away, a part of her, the part that still saluted the flag and honored her fallen comrades, knew that she could not. She knew what she had to do. The squeegee hung in Elena's hand like a forgotten tool. She had left her cleaning gear at the coffee shop and walked straight home, the scrape of her tool on the glass still ringing in her ears. The quiet rage she had felt was now a cold, solid lump in her stomach. She had been trying to build a new life, a peaceful one, but some things from the old life simply refused to die. Honor was one of them. She went inside her small, tidy house, and the silence felt different now. It no longer felt like a calm refuge, it felt like a heavy weight. She saw her reflection in the dark window of her living room and didn't recognize it. The woman staring back, the neat bun, the simple work closet was all a disguise. The real Alina was a ghost, a whisper on the wind. A woman who had once held a different kind of tool in her hands, a tool far more precise and far more deadly than a squeegee. Her mind drifted back to the CheyTac M200. It wasn't just a rifle. It was an extension of herself. She had spent thousands of hours with it, learning its every nuance, every click, every slight change in its balance. It was a beautiful, powerful machine, and she had used it to protect her team, to save lives, to change the course of terrible situations from miles away. The thought of Gary, a man who measured his skill by a local competition and a cheap trophy, speaking its name with such disrespect made her blood run cold. She had to show him, not for the money or the prize, but for the principle of it all. Problem was, she didn't have a rifle anymore. After her last tour, after the terrible silence that followed, she had decided to leave everything behind. The medals, the pictures, the memories, and most importantly, the weapons. They were locked away, stored in a secure government facility far from Willow Creek. She wanted a fresh start, a clean slate. Now, that clean slate felt like a hollow betrayal of her past. The next day, as she walked into the hardware store to buy new cleaning fluid, she saw an older man standing behind the counter. His name was Walter, and he was a fixture in Willow Creek. He was a retired Marine, his jacket still bearing the faded patches of his service. He had a kind face, a thick white mustache, and eyes that had seen more than a man should. He had been a silent observer of Gary's taunts. Walter waited until the store was empty, and then he looked at Alina. "They're running their mouths again." "I see," he said, his voice a low rumble. Alina just nodded, not wanting to talk about it. "I saw that story in the paper too," Walter continued, not unkindly. "It said you were a real hellion out there, a ghost. They called you." He looked at her hands, the strong knuckles, the calm way she held herself. "You got the look of a person who knows the cost of a bullet." Elena's eyes met his, and for the first time since she arrived in Willow Creek, she felt seen. Walter wasn't trying to flirt or get a rise out of her. He was a fellow soldier, and he understood. "I don't have my rifle anymore," she said, the words coming out almost as a whisper. A slow smile spread across Walter's face. "I figured as much. A sniper's rifle isn't the kind of thing you can just keep in the closet. But I know a guy, an old friend of mine. His name is Frank. He runs a private shooting range a few towns over. He's a collector. He's got all sorts of beautiful, complicated things in his arsenal. If anyone has a CheyTac M200, it's him." Alina felt a spark of hope. She had been so lost in her shame and anger that she hadn't considered a solution. Walter, a man she barely knew, was offering her a lifeline. He wasn't a hero, just a simple man doing a good thing. It was a moment of true kindness, of respect. earned not through words, but through silent understanding. Can you talk to him for me? She asked, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. I need to, I need to show them. I know, Walter said. I'll make the call. 2 days later, Alina was driving down a long, dusty road toward Frank's private range. It was a simple, no-frills place. Just a few trailers, a long, wide field, and the silent, distant hum of the world. She met Frank, a grizzled old man with a kind face and a love for his guns. Walter had told him the story. Frank looked at Alina and then at the paper. A sniper, huh? He said, a quiet respect in his voice. We don't get many of you out here. I've got one. It's a beauty. An old beast, but still shoots like a dream. He led her to a long, heavy case. When he opened it, Alina felt a jolt go through her. There it was, the CheyTac M200. It was a beautiful, intimidating weapon. It was all dark metal and powerful lines. Its scope gleamed in the dim light of the range. Alina reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and wrapped her hands around the familiar grip. The weight, the balance, the cold metal, it was all there. It felt like coming home. She was no longer a window cleaner. She was a soldier again. The quiet, terrible rage she had felt was now a solid, cold resolve. She would practice, she would train, she would show Gary and Dustin not just that they were wrong, but that their ignorance was a betrayal of every soldier who had ever served. She would show them what a real rifle felt like. The dusty air at Frank's private range smelled of earth, oil, and a history of spent gunpowder. The sun beat down on the wide open field, baking the cracked ground. Alina stood 100 feet from the first target, the CheyTac M200 resting on a bipod in front of her. It was a simple paper target with a bullseye, but to her it felt like a 100-foot walk back into her past. Frank watched from a respectful distance, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. He had given her a simple nod, and then the range was hers. Her heart was pounding. It wasn't the excitement of a new mission or the fear of battle. It was the heavy, emotional beat of a door creaking open that she had sealed shut years ago. She closed her eyes, trying to clear her head. The silence was deafening. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Steady now. The old words, the training, came back to her. Slow your breath. Control your mind. The rifle is an extension of you. Don't fight it. She opened her eyes, lowered her face to the stock, and looked through the scope. The bullseye was a small, blurry dot at first. Her hands, the hands that had so carefully polished windows, were shaking. The memory of Gary's words, squeaky, and his son's snickers, came back to her. It was all a silly game to them, but to her it was a debt she owed to every man and woman she had served with. She took a deep breath, letting the cold, clear air fill her lungs. Then she released it slowly, holding the last bit in her lungs for a moment, just like she had been taught. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was a loud, sharp crack that shattered the silence. The recoil was a familiar, solid thump against her shoulder. The bullet hit the paper target, but not the bullseye. It was off to the side, a sad, lonely hole in the paper. She tried again, and then again. The first 10 shots were all over the place. Her mind was a battlefield of memories, and her body was fighting against a long-forgotten rhythm. She was a soldier trying to be a window cleaner, and now the two worlds were crashing into each other, creating a painful, beautiful mess. She could feel the old muscles in her arms and back protest. The rifle was heavy, a beast of a machine, that demanded respect, and she had forgotten how to give it. Frank walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't say a word about her misses. Instead, he just looked at her, his wise old eyes seeing more than she was showing. Sometimes, he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, you have to let the old ghost come out to play. She's been in the attic for a while, she might be a little cranky. Alina nodded, a single tear tracing a line through the dust on her cheek. She hadn't cried in years. The memory of a mission, a dusty, sun-bleached hill, and the face of a fallen teammate, a boy named David, flashed in her mind. He had trusted her. He had trusted her to be the ghost in the shadows, to have his back, to make the one shot that mattered. She had made the shot, but it had come too late to save him. The memory was a heavy chain around her heart. She looked at the rifle again. This wasn't just about Gary and his pride. It was about David. It was about all the quiet heroes who had served and sacrificed. It was about finding her own redemption in the echoes of her past. She spent the rest of the day in a quiet, painful rhythm. Load, aim, breathe, shoot, miss, repeat. The sun set, painting the sky in fiery colors, and the long shadows stretched across the range. Her shoulder ached, her hands were sore, but her mind was starting to clear. She was no longer fighting the ghost. She was inviting it back in. She was embracing her old self. Frank brought her a cold bottle of water. "You'll get there," he said simply. "It's not like riding a bike. It's like finding a part of yourself you thought was lost forever." The next day she returned, and the day after that, and the day after that. The shaking in her hands lessened. The shots got closer to the bullseye. The distance grew longer. She moved back 100 feet at a time, each step a small victory. The scope became her world. She learned to read the wind again, to feel the slightest shift in the air, to understand how a change in temperature could affect a bullet's flight. She was a symphony of precision, a quiet artist with a deadly paintbrush. The town of Willow Creek was still talking. Gary and Dustin were telling everyone that Elena had run away, that she was a coward, and that they would have an easy time winning the competition. But Walter, the retired Marine, would just nod and smile to himself. He knew he had seen the look in her eyes. He knew she would return. 1 week before the competition, Elena stood 1,000 feet away from the target, a great distance for a local match. The sun was high, the wind was a gentle whisper. She closed her eyes for a moment, and her mind was clear. She saw nothing but the bull. She wasn't just a window cleaner, and she wasn't just a soldier, she was both. She was a woman who had found a purpose again. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was a single, clean report. Frank, who was watching through his binoculars, just smiled. The Willow Creek Gun Club was buzzing with a nervous energy that could be felt from 100 yards away. It was the day of the Golden Eagle competition, the biggest local event of the year. Cars were parked in neat rows along the gravel drive. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces a mix of excitement, curiosity, and a little bit of small-town gossip. There was a big wooden stand with a red and white banner that read, "Willow Creek's Best Shooter," and a Golden Eagle trophy, looking proud and shiny, sat on a velvet cloth. Gary and Dustin were already there, holding court. Gary, in a brand new hunting vest, was polishing his rifle with a soft cloth, talking loudly about the wind and the perfect conditions for a skilled shooter. Dustin, a bit more fidgety, was nodding along, clearly enjoying the attention. They were the favorites, the ones everyone expected to win. The town had heard all about their prowess at the range, and their mockery of the quiet new woman who cleaned windows. Then a quiet hush fell over the crowd. A car pulled up, an old sedan that looked as well used and honest as its driver. Elena stepped out. She was wearing simple jeans, a comfortable flannel shirt, and a pair of sturdy boots. Her dark hair was still in a neat bun, but her eyes held a calm intensity that was new to the townspeople. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She walked straight over to where Frank and Walter were standing. Walter just smiled and gave her a small, respectful nod. Frank, who had a heavy rifle case with him, handed it to her. The case was worn and old, not shiny like Gary's. Elena took it, her movements slow and deliberate, and carried it to the shooting bench without a word. Gary saw her and let out a deep, mocking laugh. "Look who decided to show up," he said. Loudly, I guess Private Squeaky found herself a real gun. "Hope you know which end to point." Dustin laughed, and a few people in the crowd chuckled nervously. Elena didn't even look in their direction. She just set the case down and began to unlatch it. The sound of the latches clicking open was sharp and final. She pulled out the CheyTac M200, a beast of a machine that looked out of place among the lighter, more common hunting rifles. Its dark, heavy frame and powerful scope were things of a different world, a world most of these people had only seen in movies. The competition started with the shorter distances, and Gary was an excellent shot. He was fast and confident, hitting bullseye after bullseye. The crowd cheered, and Gary gave a triumphant grin to Elena, who was calmly setting up her rifle, her movements a study in precision. Dustin, who went next, was also good, but not as good as his father. He was a little shaky, a little too eager, but he still did well. When it was Elena's turn, she took her time. She didn't rush. She checked her rifle, adjusted her position, and closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep, slow breath. The sound of a bird chirping in a nearby tree was louder than the murmurs of the crowd. She squeezed the trigger, and a single, clean shot echoed across the field. When they checked the target, it was a perfect bullseye. The crowd was silent. It was a good shot, a very good shot, but it was only the first one. That as the targets moved to longer distances, the real challenge began. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, was now a tricky thing, swirling and changing. Gary, with all his local pride, started to struggle. His shots were still good, but they weren't perfect. He began to curse under his breath, his face a mask of frustration. Dustin, too, was missing the mark, his confidence from the beginning of the day slowly fading. Then it was Elena's turn for the longest distance, the final shot that would decide the winner of the Golden Eagle. The target was a small, lonely dot, so far away it was almost impossible to see with the naked eye. The crowd was hushed, leaning forward. Gary stood with his hands on his hips, a smirk on his face. He was sure she couldn't make this shot. He had missed his last two at this distance. Elena lay down behind the CheyTac M200, her body an unmoving part of the bench. She looked through the scope, her world narrowing to just the crosshairs and the tiny, distant bullseye. She wasn't thinking about Gary or the crowd. She was thinking about wind speed, bullet drop, and the feel of the rifle in her hands. She was a ghost again, a silent hunter in a world of noise. She took a deep breath, and then, in the silence, she squeezed the trigger. The shot was a single, powerful report, and then the sound of the bullet traveling 1,000 feet was swallowed by the air. It felt like an eternity before the signal came back from the target. The crowd waited, their breath held. When the message came, the person working the targets held up a small white card. A perfect bullseye, a single small hole right in the center. A cheer went up, not for Gary, but for Elena. It was a sound of true surprise and respect. The men who had been teasing her were now silent. Gary's face had gone from a smirk to a look of complete shock, then to a dark, angry red. Dustin just looked at the ground, embarrassed. Elena, without a word, packed her rifle back into its case. She didn't look at Gary, she just looked at Walter and Frank, and gave them a small smile. She had won. The Golden Eagle trophy was hers, but what she had really won was something far more important, her respect. The town of Willow Creek had seen a ghost, and the ghost was a hero. The cheers of the crowd had faded, replaced by a quiet, reverent hum. The Golden Eagle trophy sat on the table, its polished surface reflecting the setting sun. Elena stood beside it, her rifle packed away, a calm look on her face. People came up to her, one by one. The butcher, the baker, the hardware store owner, all the faces that had once looked at her with polite indifference or, in some cases, outright scorn, now looked at her with genuine awe. That was a shot, ma'am, a man said, shaking his head in disbelief. I've never seen anything like it. Martha, the kind woman from the coffee shop, hugged her. I knew it, she whispered. I knew you were a hero. Gary and Dustin stood on the edge of the crowd, their faces dark and angry. Gary, unable to let his humiliation go, stomped over, his booming voice no longer a sign of confidence, but of a desperate man clinging to a lie. You cheated, he growled. That rifle's not even legal for this kind of competition. It's a military weapon. A silence fell over the crowd. Elena didn't even flinch. She just looked at him, her eyes calm and steady. It's a bolt-action rifle, she said, her voice clear and even. It's legal, but you know that, don't you, Gary? Because you've spent so much time on the range. The words were a quiet dagger, and Gary had no defense. He just stood there, sputtering, his face a deep shade of crimson. Dustin tugged at his arm. Dad, let's just go, he said quietly. We're not going anywhere. Gary yelled, pushing his son away. He looked at the trophy, then back at Elena, his face twisted with rage. You're just a window cleaner. You don't belong here. Just then, a sleek black car, a vehicle far too expensive for Willow Creek, pulled into the parking lot. A man in a sharp, dark suit stepped out. He was tall, with graying hair and an air of quiet authority. He looked around the crowd, his eyes landing on Elena. The murmurs began again. No one knew who he was. He walked right up to the competition table, ignoring Gary completely. Elena, he said, his voice a deep, respectful tone. I've been looking for you. Elena's calm exterior cracked just a little. She recognized the man. He was Colonel Marcus Thorne, a highly decorated officer from her old command. He was a man of honor, a man she had respected and admired. She had thought she would never see him again. The colonel looked at Gary. What's the problem here? He asked, his voice now a cold steel dot. Gary for once was intimidated. He didn't know this man, but he knew authority when he saw it. She's just a window cleaner, sir. She doesn't belong here. The colonel's eyes, as sharp as a sniper's, fixed on Gary. She is Staff Sergeant Elena Reynolds, he said, the words cutting through the air. She is one of the finest soldiers our nation has ever produced. She is a decorated hero, a true patriot, and a sniper who has saved more lives than you can count. The crowd gasped. They had heard whispers, but to hear it from this man, this figure of authority, made it real. I need to talk to her in private, the colonel said. But first, I think this town deserves to know the truth. He turned to face the crowd, his expression grim. I'm sure you've all heard the stories, the news reports. about the failed mission, the lost men, and the scapegoat they tried to make of her. The townspeople were silent, their faces a mix of confusion and horror. It was all a lie, the colonel said, his voice raw with emotion. Alina was the only reason any of our men survived. She stayed behind, providing cover, while her team made it out. They were all saved because of her, but she was captured. He stopped, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, and then he looked directly at Gary. They tortured her, they tried to get her to give up her team, their positions, their secrets, but she never broke. She took the beating, she took the pain, she took the insults. She was a ghost, a hero, a silent guardian. And when she finally escaped, she came back to a country that, thanks to a few politicians covering their own mistakes, had called her a failure. He looked at Alina and his expression softened. We've spent years trying to find the truth, trying to clear your name, and now we have. We found the evidence. The full story is going to be released to the public tonight. You're a hero, Alina. A true hero. Tears streamed down the faces of several people in the crowd. Martha was openly sobbing. Walter, the retired Marine, just gave a slow, proud nod. Gary and Dustin stood frozen, their faces pale, their pride shattered into a million pieces. Elena's victory at the competition was no longer just about a trophy. It was about the truth, about her own redemption, and about the justice that had finally found its way home. The colonel offered her a job, a place back in the military, but Alina just smiled. Thank you, sir, she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength, but I think I've found my place. Willow Creek has some dusty windows that need cleaning, and I think I'm pretty good at it. She looked out at the town, the small, quiet place that had become her home. She saw Walter, Frank, and Martha, and the faces of the people who now understood. She wasn't a window cleaner in disguise. She was a hero, a soldier, a woman of immense courage, who had finally found her peace.